Most cold cases go cold because the killer runs. He changes his name, crosses a state line, disappears into a city where nobody knows his face. That is what everyone assumes. That is not what happened here. The man who killed Jodie Loomis stayed exactly where he was. Same county, same roads, same neighborhood. For 46 years, he lived within miles of the dirt track where he left her to die, and nobody knew. Most people also assume that cold cases fail because there was nothing to find. This case had evidence from the very first night. Physical evidence, biological evidence. Evidence that sat in a storage room for 36 years, waiting for someone to look at it under the right light. What happened on a dirt road in Washington state in August 1972 took nearly half a century to unravel. And when it finally did, it changed how America hunts killers who think they've gotten away with it forever. In the summer of 1972, the area east of Bothell, Washington was a landscape of farms, isolated horse properties, and dark stretches of timber. It was the kind of place where a scream would just lose itself in the trees, and where a killer could stand on a dirt road, look in every direction, and see absolutely no one. Nearly half a century later, it would become a suburb of condos and chain stores and parking lots. But in August 1972, it was quiet in the way that only rural places are quiet, the kind of quiet that hides things. Jodie Gwynne Loomis had grown up in that world and loved it. She was 20 years old, 5'2", blonde hair, blue eyes, and the kind of person who did not look away from things that bothered her. When she once came across hunters shooting pigeons in a field, she didn't keep walking. She confronted them, told them off to their faces, and brought one of the wounded birds home. She nursed it back to health. That was who she was. She had painted a mural of running horses across her bedroom wall. She kept a horse named Saudi at a stable 6¼ miles from her family's home on Winesap Road. She couldn't keep him at the house, so she visited as often as she could. She was studying to become a nurse. She was engaged to a man named Jim, who had moved into the family home earlier that year. She had celebrated her 20th birthday in June. On August 23, 1972, Jodie put on a summery cropped shirt and jeans. She decided to ride her white 10-speed bicycle to the stable instead of waiting for her parents to drive her. The first time she had ever made that choice. Before she left, she borrowed her 12-year-old sister Jana's boots, size 5½, St. Moritz brand. The kind with thick waffle stomper soles, the kind you wear for riding. Her mother watched her get ready and did what mothers do. She handed Jodie a dime. "Call home if you're going to be late." Jodie took the dime, promised she'd be back before dark, and pedaled away. She stopped at her neighbor Linda Hook's back door on the way out, knocked, asked if Linda wanted to come ride horses with her. Linda said no. She was packing boxes, getting ready to move back to California. She watched Jodie get back on her bike and ride away down Winesap Road. "I can see her cute little face peeking in my back window," Linda Hook said nearly 50 years later, standing in a courtroom, her voice breaking before she pulled it back together. "I can see her." That was the last time Linda Hook ever saw her. Jodie rode east along Bothell Everett Highway, then turned onto Penny Creek Road, heading into the trees. She had made it about 3½ miles, just past the halfway point to the stable. At the corner fruit stand near 164th Street SW, a 14-year-old girl named Kenda Machoro was selling bags of apples from her family's farm. She watched a young woman on a white bicycle pause at the intersection, then turn east up the hill and disappear into the trees. Kenda Machoro would stop by the county courthouse every few years, for the next 47 years, to ask if anyone had found out who killed her. 30 minutes later, 5:30 in the afternoon, a young couple turned down a dirt track off Penny Creek Road in a dark blue Saab Sonnet. The car had 2 seats. Walter Morris was 33. His girlfriend Kathy Lenack was 18. They were not supposed to be there together. Nobody was supposed to know about them. A tree was blocking the road. Morris got out to move it. 15 feet beyond the log, a young woman was lying on her back in the dirt. Her clothing was heavily disturbed. One boot untied, a wound above her right ear. She was breathing. She was not speaking. Her glasses were askew on her face, and her eyes were open, but she was not there. There was no time to find her clothes. Morris lifted her into the passenger seat. Kathy held her head up to keep her airway open and used her own body to shield her from passing cars as they drove. Jodie Loomis could not speak. She never spoke again. She was pronounced dead on arrival at Stevens Memorial Hospital in Edmonds. No ID, no purse, no driver's license. The hospital staff did not even know her name. Back on Winesap Road, the Loomis family was waiting. The sun had gone down. The phone had not rung. That dime her mother pressed into her hand before she left. It was found at the scene that night. Still unspent. She never made the call. A detective knocked on the door after dark. Jodie's mother collapsed the moment she heard the words. Her father lunged forward to catch her. He didn't make it in time. Jana, 12 years old, standing in the hallway of her own home, watched both of her parents break at the same moment. I don't remember much after that. Jana would say one day, "It's like everything went black by morning. Investigators had a full crime scene. Physical evidence, biological evidence. A dead 20-year-old with her whole life ahead of her. They were about to pursue every lead they had, her fiancé, the neighbors, a biker gang, even a serial killer whose name was already spreading fear across the Pacific Northwest. Within 2 years, every single one of those leads would be completely dead. They had everything they needed to solve it. That is what made it so hard to understand later. When the years started piling up, investigators had a crime scene. They had biological evidence collected at autopsy. They had a .22 caliber shell casing. They had witnesses who had been in those woods 30 minutes after it happened. In 1972, DNA profiling did not exist, but what they had should have been more than enough. It wasn't. The first suspect was Jim Roberts, Jodie's fiancé. He had moved into the Loomis family home earlier that year. The couple had plans to marry. When investigators went to find him the night of August 23rd, they found him at work at Stevens Memorial Hospital, the same building where Jodie's body had just been brought. He had been on shift for hours, surrounded by colleagues who could account for every minute of his time. He was cleared before the sun came up. The second lead was a ranch owner in the area, a man whose behavior around Jodie had been noticed by neighbors, the kind of thing people saw and didn't report. Investigators questioned him. No physical evidence placed him in the woods. No connection held. A tenant on nearby property had been chopping wood close to the dirt track that afternoon and couldn't clearly account for where he had been. Investigators looked hard at him. Nothing connected him to the scene either. Then a tip came in about a biker gang operating in the area, the Reaper's Roadmen. Members had allegedly been bragging about assaulting and murdering a young woman. The detail that made investigators pay attention: a .22 caliber pistol, same caliber as the weapon used on Jodie. The FBI ran ballistics on the connection. It collapsed. The gun didn't match. The tip went nowhere. 3 suspects, 3 walls, all of it gone inside of 2 years. Then came Ted Bundy. By 1974, something was wrong across the entire Pacific Northwest. Young women were disappearing, college age, pretty, traveling alone in Washington State, in Oregon, in Utah. Law enforcement was beginning to understand they were looking at one man moving between states, leaving almost nothing behind. His name was starting to surface in briefings across the region. In Snohomish County, people began asking the question that investigators were already asking quietly among themselves. Was Jodie the first? Had the same man come through these roads 2 years earlier, and nobody had made the connection? Investigators pulled the Loomis file and laid it next to everything they knew about Bundy's pattern. On paper, it fit. Jodie was 20. College age. She was attractive. She wore her blonde hair parted down the center. Several of Bundy's confirmed victims had exactly that hairstyle. The geography overlapped. The timing was possible. For a brief, cold moment, the theory held together. Then it fell apart. Bundy did not operate like this. His method was specific and consistent. He used deception, a fake arm sling, a crutch. He would approach women in public places, ask for help carrying something to his car, and by the time they understood what was happening, it was too late. His victims got into his car voluntarily. Jodie was on a bicycle, alone on a rural road. There was no ruse. There was no car. Bundy bludgeoned his victims with blunt force. Jodie had been shot with a .22 caliber pistol. The method was completely different. The signature was completely different. Bundy was eliminated. And with that elimination, the last real direction the investigation had pointed in went dark. The case transitioned from an active manhunt to a stack of paperwork. The detectives who had worked it moved to other cases. Some retired over the following years. Some died. Every few years, someone new would pull the box down, go through everything, find nothing that hadn't already been found, and put it back. The case was technically still open in every way that mattered. It was frozen. Jodie's parents kept calling. They asked the same question every time. Investigators had nothing to tell them. The years became a decade. The decade became two. Jana Loomis Smith had been 12 years old when she lent her sister those boots. She grew up, built a life, but the case never left her. She kept calling the sheriff's office. She kept showing up at press conferences whenever the department made noise about cold cases. She refused to let Jodie become a name that nobody said out loud anymore. In 2008, 36 years after the murder, she sat down with a reporter and said what she had been holding for 3.5 decades. "I want them to sweat," she said. "I want them to know we're looking. I want them to wonder if there is DNA that can solve the case." Imagine 35 years, thinking you've gotten away with it. She was talking directly to someone. She just didn't know his name yet. That same year, the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office tried something new. They put together a deck of playing cards, 52 unsolved cases, and distributed them through county jails. The logic was simple. Inmates talk. Someone might have heard something from a cellmate, a bunkmate, someone who liked to brag about what they had done. Jodie's face appeared on the 10 of hearts. Inmates eating lunch or playing poker in a cell block were suddenly looking at two photographs, one of her in her riding gear beside Saudi, and another showing those round, tinted glasses she wore when she pedaled away from her house that afternoon. Her case was the oldest in the deck. A civilian volunteer named Chuck Wright carried her card in his wallet for the next 10 years. He wrote about her regularly in his column in the Mill Creek Beacon, keeping her name in print, keeping the case alive in the community that had forgotten it. "Some cases just grab you," he said when the arrest finally came years later. Nobody came forward. The cards produced nothing. The case was now 33 years old, every suspect cleared, every lead exhausted. The biological evidence collected the night Jodie died sat in a storage room at the sheriff's office, untouched, unexamined by any technology that hadn't existed in 1972. In 2005, a cold case detective named Jim Scharf pulled the Loomis file for the first time. What he found in that evidence room would stop him cold. Jim Scharf had been a detective long enough to know when a case was winnable. He pulled the Loomis file in February 2005. 33 years old, the oldest unsolved homicide in Snohomish County history. He read every page, every report, every dead end, and when he was done, he was not discouraged, because buried inside that file was something the original investigators never had the technology to use. The 1972 autopsy had collected biological traces, intact forensic samples preserved in evidence storage. If that sample had survived 3 decades in a box, it contained a complete DNA profile of the man who killed Jodie Loomis. Upload it to CODIS, the FBI's national database of convicted offender DNA, and if he had ever been convicted of a qualifying offense, the system would find him. But when the request hit the evidence log, the room came back with news that nobody was prepared to hear. The vaginal swabs were gone. The underwear collected at the scene gone. The bullet, the actual .22 caliber round that had been pulled from Jodie Loomis's skull during her autopsy, gone. Vanished from storage sometime during the long dormancy of the file. Nobody could trace exactly when, possibly mislabeled during one of the department's reorganizations, possibly destroyed during a clerical review that mistakenly marked the case as resolved. The paper trail ended in a blank. Scharf later described his team's reaction in a single word: flabbergasted. Everything they had built their plan around, every biological sample that should have made the straightforward, had ceased to exist. The case that was supposed to take weeks had just lost its entire foundation before it started. What remained was almost nothing. Jodie's shirt, her bra, her jeans, both boots. Items that had sat in storage since 1972, examined multiple times across multiple decades, and never yielded anything useful. Scharf sent all of it to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab anyway. There was no other move to make. If any trace of the killer existed anywhere on any of those items, anything the technology of 1972 had been too primitive to detect, this was the only way to find it. That was 2005. 3 years passed. In October 2008, a WSP Crime Lab technician was working through the evidence from the Loomis case. He had Jodie's left boot on his examination table. He had been through the shirt, the bra, the jeans. Nothing. He turned the boot under a different angle of light, equipment and methodology that simply had not existed when the FBI examined these same boots in the 1970s. He saw something on the heel, a small spot, faint. Easy to miss under the wrong conditions. which is exactly why 3 separate agencies had missed it across 36 years. The county coroner's office, sheriff's detectives, the FBI, all of them had handled these boots, cataloged these boots, examined these boots. None of them had seen what this technician was now looking at under a different light in a different era. He brought it under the microscope. It was a biological match. A tiny biological stain on the exterior heel of the left boot. The boot Jana had lent her sister. The boot Jodie had been in the process of tying when she was shot, preserved for 36 years in an evidence locker, invisible to every investigator who had ever touched it. And now, under the right light with the right tools, suddenly and completely visible. The technician called Scharf. Scharf did not wait for a written report. He drove to the crime lab himself, walked to the technician's workstation, and leaned over the microscope. He counted what he saw on the slide, 25 spermatozoa. "It was wonderful," he said later. "We actually do have what we need to solve this case." The technician extracted a partial DNA profile from the stain. 36 years in storage had degraded it, but not destroyed it. It was usable. It was uploaded to CODIS, and the system began running it automatically, comparing it against every convicted offender in the national database. Every day, against every new entry as people were convicted and added to the system. No match came back. The man who killed Jodie Loomis was not in CODIS. Whatever crimes he had committed, and the biological evidence made clear he had committed at least one, none of them had resulted in a conviction that required a DNA sample. He had slipped through every net the system had ever tried to cast. Jodie's father, John, had died in March 2005, just weeks after Scharf reopened the file, weeks before the boots were even sent to the lab. He had spent 33 years calling the sheriff's office and asking the same question. He had never heard the word CODIS. He had never heard about the boot. He died the same month his daughter's case finally started moving again, and he never knew. For the next 10 years, that genetic profile ran silently through the federal network. Every single day, automatically checking new arrests, new convictions, new entries. Out in the real world, the killer was aging. He was living a normal life. He was going about his days completely unaware that his biological signature was cycling through a supercomputer every 24 hours, waiting for a match that never came. He thought he was safe. He had been safe for 36 years. He had no reason to believe that was about to change. He had no idea that the man hunting him was about to stop looking for him entirely. In July 2018, Scharf stopped trying to find the killer directly. He started looking for his family instead. To catch the man who killed Jodie Loomis, Detective Jim Scharf had to stop looking for him entirely. He had to start looking for his family instead. It was a strategy called forensic genealogy, and inside Scharf's department, they had just watched it do the impossible. The same technique had cracked the 1987 murders of a young Canadian couple, a case frozen for 30 years. Scharf had seen it work from inside the same building. In July 2018, he sent the boot stain profile to Parabon Nanolabs, a private forensic laboratory in Virginia that specialized in finding people who weren't in any database. The logic wasn't hidden in a police system. It was sitting on public ancestry websites. Millions of profiles, uploaded by ordinary people looking for long-lost cousins, tracing immigration routes, trying to understand where they came from. None of them uploaded their DNA to help solve a murder. They uploaded it to find family. But if any one of them shared enough genetic material with the crime scene profile, it meant they were biologically connected to whoever left that stain on Jodie's boot 36 years ago. Parabon extracted a workable profile from the stain and uploaded it to GEDmatch. The database returned several partial matches, distant relatives of an unknown male, people scattered across the country who had no idea their weekend ancestry project had just connected them to a 1972 murder investigation in Washington state. Oregon-based genealogist Deb Stone took over from there. What she did next took 58 hours across 3 days. She took the killer's partial profile and began working it in reverse, cross-referencing census records, marriage certificates, obituaries, birth announcements, and public family trees, building a massive genealogical map backward through generations until the lines stopped diverging and started converging, branch by branch, decade by decade, generation by generation. They pointed to a couple in Edmonds, Washington, Jaquetta, and Albert Miller. The suspect, Stone concluded, had to be one of their 6 sons, 6 brothers. One of them had forced Jodie Loomis off her bicycle on a dirt road in August 1972. Detectives ran background checks on all 6. 5 came back clean, 1 didn't. Terrence Miller had a criminal record involving sexual conduct. In 1968, 4 years before Jodie's murder, he had been convicted of indecent exposure to a minor. He had driven a company truck up to a teenage girl walking alone, called her over to the vehicle, and engaged in deeply inappropriate behavior. When police questioned him, he admitted it. He was convicted. That conviction had been sitting in court records for 50 years. But it predated mandatory DNA collection laws by decades, laws that simply didn't exist yet when Miller committed that offense. He had never been required to submit a DNA sample. He had never been entered into CODIS. That was why 10 years of daily automated searches had returned nothing. He had a qualifying criminal history. The system just hadn't been invented yet when he built it. He was now 76 years old, retired, still living in Edmonds, still within blocks of 164th Street SW, the road that runs directly past the dirt track where Jodie's body was found. He had worked heavy equipment all over Western Washington from 1958 to 1995. He and his wife ran a small ceramics business out of their garage. On Facebook, where he remained active, he looked exactly like what his neighbors believed him to be, a quiet retiree selling pottery on weekends. Before moving to surveillance, detectives paid a visit to his home. Standard procedure following up on the case, nothing that would signal alarm. Miller's wife answered the door and invited them inside. The ceramic shop occupied part of the garage, shelves of finished pieces, packing materials. The quiet clutter of a small home business built over decades. And on a table near the work area, detectives noticed something that had nothing to do with ceramics. A single copy of the Daily Herald, a newspaper, nearly 7 months old. The front page headline was about a cold case arrest, specifically how Snohomish County detectives had used the new forensic genealogy technology to catch a killer in a separate 1987 double homicide, the same technology, the same county. The same method that had just been used to find Terrence Miller's name inside a family tree built from strangers. The prosecution would later stand in front of a jury and argue that this newspaper was not a coincidence, that it was evidence of a man who had spent years watching, tracking, reading every article about how investigators were closing in on cold case killers across the county, educating himself on the exact tools now being used against him, and keeping the one article that described his own unraveling. The defense would have an answer ready. The couple kept old newspapers to shred as packing material for their ceramics. The headline was sitting on a table because it was waiting to wrap a vase. It was, they would say, nothing more than coincidence. The jury would have to decide which explanation fit a man who had been living minutes from a murder scene for 46 years without ever drawing a single glance from law enforcement. But that jury was still 2 years away. Right now, detectives had a name, they had a target. And on the table in his home was an article describing the exact technology they had used to find him, which meant one question had become urgent. Did he know they were coming? They needed his DNA before he figured out he was being watched, and they had exactly 1 shot to get it. They followed him for weeks before he gave them what they needed. An undercover task force had one instruction: get something he touched with his lips. Saliva carries the cleanest DNA sample. No ambiguity. No defense attorney arguing contamination from a surface someone else could have touched. They needed his mouth on something he then threw away, so they waited. When Terrence Miller walked into the Tulalip Resort Casino north of Everett, detectives were right behind him. He bought a coffee, sat down at a slot machine, drank it, and when he was done, tossed the cup into a garbage can. The moment he walked away, detectives moved in. 2 cups, stuck together, went straight into an evidence bag. On September 6, 2018, the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab called Jim Scharf. The DNA profile from that coffee cup matched the biological profile found on Jodie Loomis's left boot. After 46 years of daily silence, Scharf finally had his answer. Terrence Miller had killed Jodie Loomis on August 23, 1972. He had been 30 years old, he had never left, but the case had to be completely airtight before anyone moved. Prosecutors immediately began building a trial package that no defense attorney could dismantle, a task made urgent by a heartbreaking detail that had nothing to do with evidence. Jodie's mother, Rosemary Loomis, was 91 years old. She had been waiting for an answer since the night she collapsed on her own floor in 1972. Investigators knew she was still alive. They wanted to make the arrest while she could still hear the news. They worked with that clock running alongside every other deadline. They didn't make it. On January 25th, 2019, Rosemary Loomis died, 91 years old. She died 75 days before Terrence Miller was handcuffed in his own driveway. Her husband John had died in 2005, weeks before the boot was even sent to the lab. Neither of Jodie's parents would ever hear his name spoken in a courtroom. Neither would ever know that the answer had been sitting in a storage room the entire time, on the heel of a borrowed riding boot their daughter was tying when she was shot, April 10, 2019. Miller came home from a brief outing with his wife of 42 years. Detectives were waiting at the door. He was taken into custody without incident and charged with first-degree premeditated murder. The following day, when the arrest was announced publicly, people in the neighborhood began to understand what had been living among them. The man they knew as Terry, the ceramics guy, had spent 46 years advertising his business, Miller's Cove, with a sign on a white picket fence outside his home. That home sat within blocks of the road that ran directly past the dirt track where Jodie's body had been found. He had never moved. He had never needed to. After the arrest, detectives made one final public appeal. When Jodie left her house on August 23, 1972, she was carrying a horse bridle. She was going to see Saudi. She brought the bridle she would need to ride him. It was never found at the scene, in the woods, or on the road. Investigators searched Miller's home, wondering if he had kept it, a trophy belonging to a 20-year-old woman who never made it to her horse. It was never recovered. That detail remains the one thread in this entire case that was never tied off. Miller pleaded not guilty. His defense team had a single argument, and they drove it through every day of a 2-week trial. The DNA was contaminated, the evidence chain was broken across 5 decades. And the only thing connecting their client to a 1972 murder was a degraded stain on a boot that had been mishandled by multiple agencies. They called it junk science dressed up as certainty. The jury heard both sides. They weighed the 980 million to 1 statistic against the contamination arguments. On Friday, November 6, 2020, after closing arguments concluded, they began deliberating. They went home for the weekend. On Monday morning, November 9th, they walked back into the Snohomish County Courthouse and resumed. Terrence Miller was not there. While the jury was arriving at the courthouse that Monday morning, police were rushing to Miller's home off 52nd Place West in Edmonds. Knowing that 46 years of total invisibility were over, the 78-year-old took his own life at home. He died just hours before the system would officially brand him a killer. The jury did not know. Nobody told them. They kept deliberating. At 1 p.m. on November 9, 2020, 3 hours after Miller's wife had called 911, 12 jurors who had no idea the defendant was already dead filed back into the jury box, looked at the empty defense table, and read their verdict into the official court record. Guilty of first-degree murder. The defense moved immediately to vacate the conviction. Their argument: Miller had died before sentencing, before any appeal, before the process was legally complete. They wanted his record wiped clean. An innocent man on paper, permanently. Superior Court Judge David Kurtz refused. In a hearing unlike almost any held before it, the judge upheld the jury's decision. He did not sentence a living man. He signed an extraordinary judicial order affirming that Terrence Miller's guilt had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And before he closed the record, he said something quietly to the courtroom that captured everything the previous 48 years had been about. Labels and symbols are important, Judge Kurtz said. And how this case is ended does matter. Outside the courthouse that day, Jana Loomis Smith stood holding a portrait of her sister Jodie in riding gear, beside Saudi, the horse she never got to see that afternoon. Jana had been 12 years old when she lent Jodie those boots. She was 60 when the verdict came in. Both of her parents were gone. She heard it without them. But she heard it. Truth never dies, Jana said. They thought it was going to die. They thought it was so old that we wouldn't be able to follow through with the truth. Terrence Miller didn't escape justice. He just ran out of places to hide.